All right, we're ready for chapters 5 and 6 of the book of Nehemiah. This is the outline we are following, borrowing from Baxter. Chapters 1 to 6 is where we will end up tonight, so we'll have covered the first section. The reconstruction of the wall, and now then after that we begin next time talking about the re-instructing of the people. So the focal point's been on rebuilding this wall. The wall's going to be completed tonight if you haven't studied ahead, and it'll be finished. So let's review chapters 1 to 4. What was chapter 1 all about? All right, Nehemiah's prayer and request. Here is Nehemiah being informed about the circumstance, the distress the city is in, and he prays about it. Chapter 2. All right, his prayer is answered. He goes to Jerusalem. He made a request to the king, and the king let him go. Why did he have to go to the king? Yes. He was a cupbearer of the king, and so a very important role. Chapter 3. All right, there is opposition. More in chapter 4. Chapter 3 is the building the wall, those who built. And so it's the list of those who worked. And so that's one of those chapters we talked about last time. We want to skip over sometimes, but it's a very important chapter. We want to skip over because it's just a list of names. This family and this family and this family and this person and that person work from this gate to that gate. So skip over all that. What value is there in that chapter? We talked about last time. Say again. Historical setting. All right, what else? Who's that? Is that you? I'm sorry? Had a mind to work. It shows they had a mind to work. It shows who worked. Ricky? Yes, it identified who was willing to work and identified some who were not willing to work. Gives reality to the story. It's a very important section of the book, and we learn a great deal from that as we did last time. Chapter 4. What's chapter 4 about? Yeah, here was the opposition from the enemies. We are opposition from without. And we mention without because we're going to see in chapter 5 there's opposition from within. All right, so that brings us to question number 1 for tonight. Write a short summary of chapter 5. Give me a short summary of chapter 5.
Interest against each fellow Jews is abolished.
All right. Here is the interest being charged against fellow Jews is abolished. It was contrary to God's law to start with, and Nehemiah puts a stop to that. All right. I call the chapter simply Abuse Among Brethren and Nehemiah's Generosity. What a contrast. In fact, part of the response Nehemiah gives to the problem is, here's how I'm dealing with this, and here's how you should deal with it, and here's what you've been doing. 2 major sections to the chapter. There's the problem of abuse among brethren, or problem from within, in contrast to chapter 4, problem from without, and then Nehemiah's generous treatment of the brethren. Make sense? Any questions about where we're going? Question number 3. What problems did the people face in chapter 5? Very similar to question 1.
They were losing the things that they had, their vineyards, their children, slaves.
All right. Very good. What else? Somebody said something else. I'm sorry. There was famine. We'll talk about the significance of that and what part that plays. All right, here's verses 1 to 13. We're going to divide that into 3 sections. Verses 1 to 5 is a complaint is brought to Nehemiah about debt and usury. But the first thing is identified is the fact that there is a famine. There was a great outcry, verse 1, of the people and their wives against their Jewish brethren. But here is the setting of that, and that's the point of the famine. Verse 2. That we, our sons and our daughters, are many, therefore let us get grain for them, that we may eat and live. So here is the first problem identified. We're in the midst of a famine, and we're having trouble getting food and for our families. Now, why would they have trouble getting food? Forget about the interest. Why would they have trouble getting food in the midst of a famine? Other than, there's a lack of food, but there's something I'm driving at here. All right, there's the enemies from without that would forbid them. Yeah, they're busy building a wall, and as we saw in chapter 3, and this is part of the value of chapter 3, there was mentioned merchants, there were mentioned farmers, etc., who've left their lands, they've left their vineyards, they've left their farms, they've left their houses, they've left their merchant stores to come and work on the wall. And so here for these 52 days, the 52 days are not identified until chapter 6, but for 52 days they're working there with no means of getting food from their farm or getting food by making money. And so things are beginning to get rough in the midst of a famine. It's not likely this famine has just started. This is probably the result of a famine that's been going for a while that may have been mentioned in other of the minor prophets. We will not take the time to trace that. And the reason I mention that, 52 days is not a long time for a famine to get real severe. So this has probably been going for a little while by the time they get to Jerusalem. And with the famine going on, there is the first cry is, we have a need for food. Here we are working on the wall, and we need to feed our families. And in order to do that, we've had to borrow money. And so there is this abuse, verses 3 to 5. So let's see what 3 to 5 has to say. Verse 3 says, they have mortgaged their lands and their vineyards and their houses that we might buy grain. There is grain to buy, not a lot, or that wouldn't be called a famine, but they're having to mortgage their lands and their houses and their vineyards. And in addition to that, they've also had to borrow money for what? Verse 4. To pay the king's tax. It's I know that from verse 1 that they've borrowed it from their Jewish brethren. So we've borrowed money from our Jewish brethren, and now we're greatly in debt to them. Now, how bad has it got? Verse 5. Turned their sons and daughters into slaves. The problem was, as Nehemiah identifies later, is a problem of usury. So let's stop for a moment. And if we don't understand the Old Testament law, then we don't understand the problem that's going on here. Charging interest within itself wasn't wrong, so we'll identify that. But let's go back to Leviticus 25, and that's the major passage that comes to play in the book of Nehemiah. You say, how do you know that's the major one? Well, there's other passages, but it almost seems as if Nehemiah quotes part of that, and I'll identify that passage a little bit later. So let's go to Leviticus chapter 25, if you will, and let's look at two sections. Here's the first section, starting at verse 35 down through verse 38, has to do with laws about interest. And we won't read all of that, but notice the first thing that's mentioned, you're to help a brother who is poor, according to verse 35. That if your brother becomes poor and falls into poverty, what are you to do? Verse 35. I'm at Leviticus 25, 35. Yeah, that he may live with you. In other words, you support him. In other words, you help him. You help those who are in need. Give to those who are in need. Second thing about this law was they could not charge interest. Look at verse 36 and 37. When you give to them, you can't charge interest. Take no usury. Usury is simply charging interest. Now, we'll give a quote from ISB in a moment. It came to mean more than that, but the word basically within itself just means charging interest. And that's how I think it's used here. Take no usury or interest from him. In other words, loan him money if he needs it, but don't charge him any interest. You're not trying to make money off of him that your brother may live with you. Verse 37, you shall not lend to your brother for usury, nor lend to him your food at a profit. So you're not interested in trying to make something off of your brother. You're interested in helping your brother, so loan him money, but not on interest. Make sense? Now, I'm not going to take the time to trace them, but if you want to make a marginal note, Exodus 22:25 says they were not to charge interest. Deuteronomy 23:19 repeats the same principle. They were not to charge interest from their brethren. Now, the third principle concerning interest, that didn't apply to the stranger. So hold a finger at Leviticus 25 and go to the book of Deuteronomy, if you will. And let's go to Deuteronomy 23. And so charging interest wasn't wrong within itself. Verse 20 says, to a foreigner you may charge interest, but to your brother you may not charge interest. So they could do that to a stranger. So here's a stranger that's in the visiting in the land of Canaan or visiting in Palestine, and he needs some money, then loan him some money. Charge him interest. But not so with your brother. Make sense? So when Nehemiah comes on the scene, he finds out they're charging interest. Now there's another problem, but they're charging interest, and that's in violation of Exodus 22, Deuteronomy 23, and also Leviticus 25. So what they were doing was wrong. Now I want to come back to that, if I can find my clicker here. And this is from ISBE, that's the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, pretty standard work on usury. It said it would be easy to go from a fair rate of interest to an unfair rate as seen in the history of the word usury, which has come to mean an exorbitant or unlawful interest. In other words, it is simply, the word usury had reference to charging interest, but it later came to mean charging an exorbitant amount of interest. And we see a little more about that a little bit later as we flow through the chapter. So I think both may have been going on here. And we'll give some evidence of that here a little bit later in in Nehemiah chapter 5. Yes, they were taking advantage of them. All right, let's go back to Leviticus chapter 25 now. That was not the only problem that is addressed. Leviticus 25, the next section we just left off, deals with laws concerning slavery. Now, I want you to think through the statement I'm about to make before you react to this, because this is not a political statement, this is not a racial statement, but it's just a biblical statement. The Bible does not anywhere specifically condemn slavery, except under some circumstance. If I'm wrong about that, then you can show me on that. It deals with principles that, if followed, would ultimately obliterate slavery. Make sense? In other words, you treat people fair, you pay them fair. I'm just talking in general terms. I'm not even talking about Leviticus 25 or Old Testament. I'm just talking about that if you treat the person fair that is supposed to be working for you, he's really going to be more of an employee than a slave. You treat him fair, treat him right, and pay him well. And you love him and you care for him, etc. Treat him and hopefully lead him to Christ. And if you do, then you're going to treat him as a brother, and so it's going to obliterate. So with that principle in mind, the laws about slavery wasn't that there could not be slaves under the old covenant, but they could not force their brother to be a slave, a fellow Jew. So let's notice beginning at verse 39 through verse 55, the whole section deals with this issue of slavery. So look at verse 39. What does verse 39 say? All right. So here's the point. You couldn't force your brother to become a slave. He's poor, and you say, I got you. You're in bad shape. I'll feed you. You know you really need, and I'll feed you and your family, but you're going to be my slave. You can't do that. All right. Verse 42 says they could not sell their brethren as slaves. So in other words, if you took them as a slave, you couldn't turn around and sell them, according to verse 42. But notice in this context, and I want to come back to this. Look back at verse 36. Concerning lending to the poor, take no usury, but fear your God. Interesting phrase. Verse 43 says, don't rule over him with rigor. Don't treat him with roughness. Verse 43. Don't treat him with severity, but you shall fear your God. We'll say more about that here in just a moment. All right, now those laws being in mind, let's go back now to this abuse as to why. Now you know why Nehemiah got angry. They come complaining, we've got to have food. And in order to get food, we're having to borrow money from our brethren. They're charging us interest. In fact, so much so, our children have become slaves of our own brethren. Make sense? That's the problem. All right, let's go to point B, Nehemiah's response. How did Nehemiah respond? He got angry. Practical lesson, if you don't already have one. You finish my sentence, there is a place for righteous anger. And so the Bible talks about anger, condemning anger at times, but there is a place. The Lord got angry, didn't he? I don't think he's too happy when he's turning the tables over of the money changers. The text says Nehemiah became angry. What do you think made him angry? They're disobeying God and mistreating one another. He got angry and then he rebukes them. He only does that after something. Verse 7. What does that mean? Interesting. Notice, good point. He got angry and then gave serious thought before he responded. How often do we get angry and respond and then we think and realize, you know what, I was a little too harsh or I went at that the wrong direction. I should have. He was angry, but he gave it serious thought and then he addressed the people. Let's see what he said, beginning at verse 7 through 10. Here's his rebuke. He rebuked the nobles and the rulers. He started with the leaders. Why them? As the leaders go, very good. So go the people. And so they're partly responsible, if not fully responsible. Each of you is exacting usury from his brother, so I called a great assembly against them. Now, some suggest, and they may be right, it seems that verse 7 is saying, I rebuked the nobles, and then I called an assembly because that was necessary. Some have suggested he rebuked the nobles. It wasn't effective, so therefore he called an assembly to make it more public. Maybe so. I'll leave that with you. Verse 8, he says, I said to them, according to the ability we have redeemed our Jewish brethren, and now will you indeed sell your brethren? What's his point?
We just got back everybody out of slavery from Babylon, and now you're trying to put people back in slavery.
Makes no sense. Makes no sense. And their reaction, verse 8, was they couldn't say anything. That stumped them. Verse 9 is an important verse. I want to spend just a moment on verse 9. He said, what you're doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of God? Isn't it interesting that they're exacting usury? He doesn't come to them and say, he doesn't word it this way, you ought not be mistreating your brethren. He doesn't say you shouldn't be exacting usury. What he says is, you should be walking in the fear of God. Now, reckon why he said that. Go back to Leviticus 25. I am convinced, and I won't argue it because I know I'm right and I don't need to argue. No, I'm not going to argue because I'm not sure I can prove this, but I'm convinced in my mind that Nehemiah is thinking not only about Leviticus 25, that he's thinking about verse 36. Now, it wouldn't have been divided in verses, but he's thinking about this phrase. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God. I'm convinced he was thinking about that particular phrase. Now, can I prove he was? No, but he almost quotes it, doesn't he? He comes pretty close to quoting it. And so that's why he says you should have been walking in the fear of God. Now, here's a practical thing I'm learning. If you fear God, you treat people right. If you don't treat people right, the problem is you don't fear God. We don't normally approach people that way. Somebody mistreats another, and we don't go up into them and say, you know what, your problem is you don't fear God. But maybe that's what we should do. Anyway, here's another thing I want you to pay attention to at verse 9. Because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies. What does that mean? Absolutely. That's the point. That when you're mistreating one another, you're giving fuel to the fire that the enemies are stirring against us. and you're just making it worse. Case in point, look at 2 Samuel chapter 12, and if you have the New King James, it'll be in your footnotes. At verse 14, this is concerning David's sin, that however, because of this deed, you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. Well, if that's true concerning David's sin, that'd be true of any sin, wouldn't it? And so here, the enemies are looking for anything that's to be against the people of God, and the people of God are sinning, and so that gives them an occasion to do that. That often happens. When there's turmoil within, that just gives an occasion for people to defame the people of God. Now, at verse 10, let's finish that section. Let's talk about 10a. Part of his rebuke was, he said, I also with my brethren and my servants am lending to them money and grain. What's he saying? I'm not expecting you to do something that I wouldn't be willing to do. What was Nehemiah lending out? He said he was. But what's he implying? When I lend out, I'm not charging interest. And so I'm lending out and I'm taking and helping. And now then, here is the solution. Point B3 here. There's two things he says. The first one is, verse 10, stop the usury. That's true of any sin, isn't it? First thing you do is stop the sin. Here's a definition of repentance. Stop the sin. Verse 10. Please let us stop the usury. Secondly, they're to do what? Verse 11. Yeah, give back everything you charge. That wasn't lawful. You weren't allowed to do that. It was against God's law, so restore all of that. Now notice he talks about 100th of the part of the grain. I know what 100th is. That's 1%. But I don't know what that implies. Some have suggested, and that's all I'm going to suggest here, is some have suggested that was a monthly charge, meaning that would be equivalent to 12% annual interest, which was more in keeping, I'm told, with the Oriental kingdoms. Barnes suggests that, Colin Dately suggests something along that line, and that they were acting like heathens, basically. The heathens do that kind of thing, charge this 12% interest of their own folks, and that's what they were doing. And that may be the case. I don't know. The information I just gave you, all those details are not in this text. So it's like pieces of the puzzle, but we're missing a piece or two, and we've supplied those. Make sense? So it is suggesting that the 1% doesn't seem to be very much interest. They weren't to charge any. But to be exorbitant or to be extreme, the 1% wouldn't be it. That may have been maybe a monthly charge. All right, verse 13 now. Wow, we've lost our computer here. Verse 13. What's his point at verse 13? All right. And so what's his point? All right. Give me a second and I'm going to recover. All right, beginning at verse 14 now. Verse 13b. I wanted to go to verse 13b is where I wanted to go next. What did the people say in response to that? They said what? Amen, which means what? So be it. And then the people did according as they had promised. Now let's begin at verse 14. 14 to 19. Let's finish this so we can get on to chapter 6. In 14 to 19 now, what's the point?
Talks about how he had
All right. Nehemiah had fed people. How many did he feed? 150 he fed. And what did he say about feeding those? All right, we don't know the total. That's exactly right. We're not given a total of how many he helped, but we are told that he fed 150. So what's his point in bringing this up? I think there's a point he's trying to make. What is it? Yeah, he's leading by example, that he did not do what they're doing. And I think the point is there is a great contrast between what he did and what these Jewish brethren are doing. And why would you do that? Why would that not be considered as being arrogant?
I mean, like you said, Danny was saying, the food that he was allowed by the government, I don't know exactly, but they had a certain allowance.
I think also that it's an example of someone who's leading by example, not saying, do what I say, but I don't do it myself. But Nehemiah also was being supported by the king, right? And therefore, he didn't have really concerns, so he took what he was blessed with and shared with the people.
Yes. All indication is that he was still continuing wages as a cupbearer. There's no indication that he's lost that, but there's not a passage that says specifically he was still getting it. But most students of the text, I understand, at least I've been told, think that he probably was continuing to receive that. But for 12 years that are mentioned here at verse 14, those 12 years would have been from 444 BC to 432 BC. And he said, that I nor my brothers ate the king's provisions. What does that suggest to you? What does that mean first, and then why did he do that secondly? All right, very, very good. Yes, notice that he's saying, I did not doing what the former governors did. They took taxation from the people, a heavy burden from the people, in order that they might be able to eat of the king. That's how he's eating of the king's provisions. It's not the king didn't pay him, but he didn't take the taxation and the burden at the burden of the people, is what I think he's saying. Two reasons for that. One, in verse 15, is because, this is a phrase we've seen several times, of the fear of God. He plays on that term. Why does he play on that term? I think he's still thinking about Leviticus 25 and 36. That with the fear of God, you don't mistreat people. And I think he's driving at them that if you fear God, this is going to take care of our problem here. But be that as it may, the second reason given in verse 18 is because the burden was heavy. So for those reasons, I didn't do that. There's something else he didn't do at verse 16. What was it? Yeah, when they came and someone is poor and now they need someone to buy their land so they have money, he said, I didn't take advantage of them. He might loan them money, he might feed them, but he did not, under any circumstance, did he buy their land. Make sense? In other words, he didn't take advantage of them when they were down. He didn't turn around and say, you're in trouble, you've got problems, and so I'm going to buy your land. And so then he takes that and sells it as a profit. He said, I didn't do that. So I think the whole point of 14 through 19 is all about how Nehemiah gives an example. I didn't do what you're doing because I feared God and the burden was great. I didn't buy, I had the money, I could have bought their houses. I didn't do that. I didn't do any of that. And so that's a contrast. Now let's go on to chapter 6. I was hoping to get you an outline of chapter 6 on the screen, but I've got two computers up there and neither are doing their job. So we're going to go without that. Let's go to chapter 6. Chapter 6 I simply call more opposition from from the enemies, and the wall is finally completed. So let's talk about verses 1 to 13. The enemies tried to stop the work. The enemies tried to stop the work. The first thing they did was, we have Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, or Tobiah and Geshem here. Sanballat comes on the scene in a moment. But Geshem, when they heard, and Tobiah, when they heard that they'd rebuilt the walls and there were no breaks in other words, they've closed the walls up, even though all the gates are not hung, that Sanballat and Geshem sent, saying, come let us meet on the plains of Ono. What does that mean? They want to have a conference. It was a plea for compromise. You often hear preachers sometimes preaching away and they'll say, we shouldn't meet with people on the plains of Ono. And you think, what in the world is he talking about? He's talking about we don't compromise. You see, when you start compromising, you're meeting on the plains of Ono. They're trying to draw him away from the work. It's a number of miles over to Ono. I've got a map that I was going to show you, but it's to the west of Jerusalem, a little northwest of Jerusalem, out on the plains. So go out on the plains of Ono and meet us. Well, it draws him away from the work. And it's a compromise, and they intended to do him harm, he said. How? Well, were they intending to kill him? Maybe. Maybe they were intending to pull him out there and meaning harm from a political standpoint, or maybe harm from some other. I'm not sure. All right, let's go further. At verse 3, what did he say in answer to that? What I'm doing is good. It's a great work, and I cannot come down, and why should the work cease? And how many times they tried to get him to do that? 4 times they tried to do that before they sent a letter. So 4 times they come, let's meet on the plains of Ono, and he kept saying, no, 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 no. All right? Let's go to verse 5. They finally, on the 5th try, do what? Send a letter. What does the letter say? They're trying to intimidate him and force him into a meeting at the plains of Ono. Because it's been reported y'all are building rebellion. You're rebuilding Jerusalem, and they're going to make you the king, and you're claiming to be king. That's what's being told. What do you learn from that? Practical.
Nehemiah's pretty wise. A lot of people have fallen for that. I mean, you see that in the political arena all the time where somebody fakes, somebody accuses them of something, they feel like they've got to defend themselves, and it draws them out. Like, instead of just walking away and say, you don't know me,
Yeah.
they get to where they feel like they have to defend.
Yeah.
They said this about me, I have to prove everything wrong, and it's just a trick. Like, he was wise to just say, nope, that's not me.
Yeah. I didn't do that. Hadn't said it. You're wrong.
And not continue that debate or try to, I'm going to prove you wrong, and then you get pulled in and distracted, and that's what they wanted the whole time.
On what basis could they say that made that charge?
Well, wasn't he related to the royal family?
That's true. Bingo. Zechariah probably. I don't know where they got the idea, but it is thought that maybe a perversion of Zechariah. Zechariah does talk about coming to Jerusalem and a king would rise up, but it's talking about the Messiah. It's not talking about they're going to come back and raise up a king in this post-exile period to rebel against the king of Babylon, the king of the Persians. No indication of that. But they may have got that idea from that we can take that message and report that that's what they're saying. Be that as it may, that is all an effort to compromise. And his response at verse 8 was, no such thing as you say is being done, but you invent it in your own heart. You just made it up. It's all made up. And so they're trying to make me afraid and weaken his hand, verse 9. All right. Verse 10 beginning. There's another effort. What's this effort?
This is a trick apparently from within. Now there's people within the city that have been compromised that they're using.
All right. There is a false prophet that's mentioned here that comes to him, and what does he say to him? Now, this would be the one I think if I were in Nehemiah's shoes, I'd come near falling for. Because this is a man who seems to be viewed as a prophet, and he comes to Nehemiah, what does he say to him? Let's go and meet in the temple and basically hide you there because they're going to try to kill you. And Nehemiah, as Melissa said a moment ago, was wise enough not to fall for that. It would be easy for him to think, well, you must be a prophet and this must be from God. But notice a couple of things that he does. What does he say?
Such a man as I run away.
Yeah, why should such a man as I flee? What does that tell you in the context of what they're doing? Because there were prophets that fled for their life. Rightly so, didn't they? Didn't Elijah do that?
He's the leader. If he flees, what's everybody else going to do?
Exactly.
He's got to stay.
He's got to stay there. We've got to finish this wall. And if I leave, everybody else is going to leave. So why should I leave and flee? Even if my life is in danger. Then I perceived that God had not sent him, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me because of Sanballat and Tobiah had hired him. In other words, he was a hired false prophet. And so there was another effort. So you could build a whole lesson around just chapter 6 of the efforts to compromise, the efforts to lie, false religion, false teachers, false prophets leading them astray. Notice at verse 14, Nehemiah makes a plea to God about his enemy. What is his plea? Yeah, you know what they did. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to their works and the rest of the prophets who have made me afraid. Remember them and the works that they've done. May they pay the price for that. Now, verse 15 is an important verse because wall's finished in 52 days. That is absolutely amazing. 52 days. And that's with all this opposition. And in that 52 days, he has to deal with Sanballat and Tobiah. He has to deal with the problem within of the abuse of the brethren. Y'all give your interest back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got a problem of poverty. We've got a problem of a famine. And he's trying to deal with all of that. And then you have these efforts of chapter 6. And that was done on the 25th day of the month of Elul, which would be approximately September 15th. So it was in the fall of the year, late summer, early fall, that the wall was finished. Now then, let's get 17 to 19. What's going on here? This happens in the political world all the time. Yes, there were some in among the Jews. What do they call it in the political world? I haven't heard it as much, and I know it's happening with Biden, but with the Trump administration, they said it all the time. And in the Reagan administration, he threatened to fire people, wanted to put them under a lie detector to find out who was doing it. What's it called? Leaks. Somebody's leaking. Somebody on the inside is helping those who are the enemies on the outside. Make sense? Somebody's telling things they shouldn't be telling. And that's what's going on here. So notice at verse 17, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and letters came to them. Some of the nobles of Judah are sending letters over to the enemy. In other words, there's, you might want to call it spies within or leaks that are going out. And here's the problem. Here's the point, something practical. Sometime among God's people, there are those on the inside helping those on the outside hate the people of God. That's happened time and again. And that's going on right here. All right. Now that's where we're going to stop, and let's finish our list, and then we'll go to practical lessons if time permits. Remember our list about Nehemiah the great leader. We're going to finish that tonight. We are ready for number 22, characteristics of a great leader. The last one that was mentioned, he got to his work and he didn't delay. Remember that? All right. Chapter 4:21 was what we gave on that, and 6:15, which is in our lesson tonight. Number 22, he was bothered and incensed by wrongdoing. Good leaders are bothered by wrongdoing. Instead of seeing sin or wrong, shrug their shoulders. He was bothered and incensed by wrongdoing. Number 23, he thought things through. Chapter 5 and verse 7. After, what was the wording? After serious thought. Leaders don't fly off the handle and say, here's what we need to do, and then, wait a minute, I should have thought about that. That was number 23. Number 24, same verse, chapter 5, 7. He was bold. He went to the leaders, to the nobles, and said, you're wrong. You're wrong. Number 25, he rebuked and corrected. Some leaders can't rebuke. This leader rebuked and corrected. Chapter 5, verse 7. And we see it later in chapter 13, verses 15, 17, and 25. We haven't got there yet. But 5 and 7 is our primary verse tonight. Number 26, he did what he expected of others. Chapter 5 and verse 10. In other words, I expect you not to charge usury. I didn't do that either. I had money to buy land. I didn't buy the land. I'm loaning them money. That's what I expect of you. Number 27, two more here. He did not compromise. Chapter 6, verses 2 to 4. He did not compromise. Leaders that compromise aren't worth anything. And number 28, and I can repeat any of these I need to. He was not intimidated. Chapter 6, beginning at verse 10. He was not intimidated. You should have a list of 28 characteristics of a leader. Anybody need any one of those repeated? Got them? Now give them back to me. No. Do what? 27. 27 is he did not compromise. Chapter 6, 2 to 4. Practical lessons now. We've got about a minute or so, maybe less, that you learn from these chapters. Practical things you take home with you. Very good. Larry?
Well, what I noticed about the nobles, how they handle people, also, they're the same ones that got their shoulders to the work. It was called out in chapter 3. So it's a good sign when you see people that put their shoulders to work. There's probably something you need to be aware of. Because that was internal. And they have just as much need to put that wall as anybody else.
Good point. That may have been a flag early on that they were going to be a problem. Practical things you take home with you.
Never lose the fear of God. And Nehemiah said more than one time, we ourselves as Christians got to remember that we always respect our Lord and God.
Absolutely. I hope you're, we'll stop on that note. I hope you're marking these phrases of the fear of God. We're going to see more in chapter 7. And we'll make a list before we get through of all the things we learn about the fear of God in this book. It has a great deal to say about the fear of God. We saw it in chapter 5 and 19 and 5 and 15 tonight. Saw it in chapter 1, verse 11 in our first study.